So we're now going to walk through the frequently made mistakes for assignment 3A, which was the assignment that used the executor completion service in order to allow a group of beings from Middle Earth to gaze into a fixed number of Palantiri. A couple things to note. As always, make sure you document your code. You'll lose points if you don't do that, so make sure you document your code. I say this in every one of my videos, and sometimes people don't remember that, but whether or not I indicate all the time that you have to document your code, you always have to document your code. So that should be sort of a generic requirement for everything. Also, make sure you address any comments I had from earlier assignments. I didn't really review that when I took a look at assignment 3A, but make sure you fix those things because otherwise you'll lose points. And also, of course, make sure that unit and integration tests are passing. Most people did a pretty good job, although we'll see that there's a bunch of subtle problems that crept into some code. And some people clearly didn't run the unit tests or integration tests because they had glaring errors that easily would have shown up had they done that. So let's start off with one of the problems I saw. Actually, a fair number of people had this problem. So remember that completion service is a generic interface. So make sure you use the proper syntax. You have to indicate what kind of result it'll return, the type of the result it'll return from take or poll or so on. And so you have to make sure you add that so that you don't get compiler warnings. Down here, there's more concise ways of writing code. You don't need to create a local variable and then turn around and return the local variable. Just go ahead and return the allocation of the new object. There's various factory methods in this code that could be improved for some people. It's not a good way to do things to have all these extra local variables. They don't really make any more meaningful behavior to the code or meaningful documentation. Also, make sure you read the specification carefully. The implementation here is designed to use a cached thread pool, not a fixed size thread pool. So don't write code like you see here, but make sure you use the cached thread pool factory method on the executor's utility class. Down here, again, remember that executor completion service is a generic type, so you have to indicate that syntactically when you define an instance of that type. And likewise, you also don't need to be verbose and put the name of the type. That can be inferred using type deduction, which was a feature added to Java somewhere around Java 5, I think. So you don't have to put those things in there, and it's just a good habit not to. And in fact, your IDE will yell at you if you try to do that. So it's again, it's a good habit to get into to do that correctly. Now let's start taking a look at some behavioral issues. Here's an implementation of begin being thread pool that needs to be improved. So first of all, make sure you use method references, not lambda expressions, wherever possible. Once again, your compiler, your IDE will warn you about that and offer to do the changes for you automatically. So just get in the habit of checking for that. It should be underlined or highlighted in some way that will indicate that you need to click and have it automatically adjusted. And also, you don't need to use collect. There's no need to collect something here. All you need to do is just use the for each method. And you don't really even need to use map. You can use for each instead. So you can use for each along with a method reference. So this whole thing can be cleaned up and made more concise and more efficient. Down here, this code, a number of people had variants of this problem. This code is not creating the executor service. I also saw code that didn't create the executor completion service. So make sure that you correctly call those factory methods. Once again, this would trivially be caught if you ran the tests. So do not forget to run the tests. Do not forget to come and ask questions in office hours or on Piazza if your tests aren't working. And if you're not doing well on these things, there's really no good reason for it because there's plenty of opportunities to get help. Also, the return result from create executor completion service needs to be stored in a field because it needs to be used later for other stuff. So make sure you store it in the right place. That also would be caught by running the test. And down here, make sure you're using the for each method, not a for each loop, and make sure you use a method reference, not a lambda expression. Let's now go ahead and turn our attention to await completion of futures. So this particular code is on the right track, but you don't want to use the for each method here. You want to use the count terminal operation and then have that result that comes back from count be stored into the processed variable. Down here, we're going to see some other problems. That's not really problems, just ways to make the code better. You can collapse the two calls to map and the one call to filter into just a call to map followed by a call to filter, and have filter check to see whether or not the result of the get call returns null. So you filter out ones that return null and then count the ones that don't. A lot of weird things people are doing for iterating through the number of beings that you're waiting for the results. One thing to do is don't use a while loop like this. Use a for loop. It's more contained. There's various ways of doing for loops. You can do an index-based for loop. You can do a range-based for loop. A couple different ways to do that. You can use a for each method, although that's a little tricky with respect to the processed, setting the processed variable. And also keep in mind that future is also generic, so make sure you put the right type using the right syntax here. And I'll leave it to you to figure out what you need to do, but it's not too hard to figure it out. Here are some other problems. This code is, for some reason, checking to see if the results are coming back in the same order that they were initiated, which there's no reason to expect that to happen because beings are gazing for different times. So you don't need to do that check, although you can use a for each loop. You just don't need to use anything with the for each parameter, the being parameter in this case. And also make sure that you increment the processed field properly, incrementing it when things succeed. Yet some other weird problems with await completion of futures. This code will never terminate because it's going to loop while get being count is not equal to 0, but there's nothing that's going to decrement the being count, so that'll just loop forever. Once again, running that through the test hopefully would have revealed that problem. If that's not being revealed to the test, please let me know, and we'll make sure the tests are fixed to catch that particular problem. This code also is not going to terminate if take or get fail, if they don't work, and the code doesn't check for that. And the reason why it doesn't work is because it doesn't call get, so we don't know whether or not it succeeded or failed. Here's some other subtle problems. This code is using the rethrow supplier approach, which is a good way to do things, but you don't have to use lambda expressions. You can use a more simple method reference here, which is a good habit to get into. And down here, we don't really need to do this particular use of the ternary operator with question mark, colon. Just use a simple if statement. That'll work just as well, and it's actually probably more efficient, although I suspect a good optimizing compiler would probably convert this into an if statement under the hood, but it's not really clear why it's written this way. Now let's go ahead and take a look at Shutdown Now. Pretty much nobody got this. I think one person got this right. And what you need to do is read the specification that says this method should only return after all threads have been terminated and all the resources have been cleaned up. So what that's saying in a nutshell is you need to make sure that you call the await termination method with some big, large value like integer max value or something like that. And that way, Shutdown Now will not return until all the threads have indeed terminated. So make sure that you add that to your code. We aren't really testing for that in the test at the moment, but we'll undoubtedly add that to a future version of the code in the unit test. And then I'm not exactly sure what this code is trying to do, but you don't need to have a while loop that keeps calling Shutdown Now and so on and so forth. I'm not quite sure what was going on there, but it's too complicated, so you don't need to do that either. Okay, so that is an overview of the frequently made mistakes that I saw when I reviewed assignment 3A. As always, please make sure that you check your code to ensure that you fix any problems. Many people did very well. Probably the one thing that everybody needs to work on is the code for Shutdown Now to make sure that you call await termination properly so that you wait until everything has been cleaned up. Okay, so that's the end of the overview here. I'm going to post this to YouTube, of course, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions about how my discussion here maps onto problems you may have with your code. And also, of course, be aware that undoubtedly some of these frequently made mistakes will show up in the next quiz.